Exercise 5.9 is another one of those problems where you just have to play with T accounts. There really is no other way to do this. So let's take a look at what they tell us. They're estimating bad debt. They're using a balance sheet method. They're using a percentage of receivables. So they tell us, and this is the information they're giving us coming in, that our accounts receivable at year end has a balance of $130,000. They're telling us that our allowance for doubtful accounts, or our allowance for uncollectible accounts, or allowance for uncollectibles, or whatever you want to call it, has a $2,100 debit balance. What that means is that last year we had more uncollected accounts than we had set up the allowance for. Last year was a bad year for collections. We collected less than we expected. So now, because we're using the balance sheet method, we have to catch up on that plus come to the final amount that we want. And they tell us that the amount that we want this year is 20% of that number. So 20% of 130,000 is 26,000. That's the number we need to have. That's where we want to end up. We have to account for the fact that we have a debit balance. In other words, we're not at we're below zero in the allowance account. So we need this number over here. So it's the same formula as before, but now we have X minus 2,100 equals 26,000. X equals 26,000 plus 2,100. X equals 28,100. Because we had to catch up, get back to zero, and then get to 26,000. If you want to think of it that way, that works okay too. I need this plus whatever the debit is to get to where I need to be. So my bad debt expense, is a debit of 28,100, and my credit to allowance for doubtful accounts is 28,100. Just like the other problem we did, but instead of having a credit balance, which we would subtract from the amount, we have a debit balance, which we add. So, we've got the numbers, let's do the accounting. So, our bad debt expense and our allowance for doubtful accounts, 28,100. So, debit bad debt expense, 28,100. Credit allowance for doubtful accounts, 28,100. Now this should not be indented because this is not a journal entry. This is just saying how would they appear in the income statement and how would they appear in the balance sheet. This is not a journal entry. So the bad debt expense would be the 28,100 that we had to recognize. The balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts is the 26,000, the 20% of the 130,000. And the last requirement, again, is going to say, please show us how you would present this in the balance sheet, and you would show accounts receivable at full face value, which would be $130,000, minus the allowance for doubtful accounts, full face value, minus the allowance for doubtful accounts, accounts receivable at net, $104,000, and that tells the users of our financial statements that out of the $130,000 that people owe us all together, we expect to collect $104,000.